So today we've heard about women moving into politics in the progressive era. We've heard about settlement house work, about writers, about women involved in the peace movement. And of course, all of these different movements bring women into the political sphere and raise the question of whether they will be able at some point to vote. So I'm curious now, how do women go about pursuing the right to vote in this period?
They go about pursuing the right to vote in many different ways. And of course, as we've just learned, different women pursue it in different ways. But there are two basic strategies. The main one is on a kind of state-by-state basis still. So several of the Western states by 1910 have already given the right of women to vote. Other states are beginning to consider it. New York State, for example, already by 1912 has a serious movement towards it. And so different women organize on a state-by-state basis to push their state legislatures into granting the right to vote and or into changing state constitutions. But the main push now begins to be, and the only assurance that women all over the country will have the right to vote is to try to push the federal government into a constitutional amendment which will provide the right to vote for everybody. And that becomes the kind of strategic goal, and it's done by means of lobbying. It's done by means of political marches, political editorials in newspapers, so taking advantage of odd situations to point out that if women did have the vote, such and such wouldn't happen. So the temperance movement, for example, which is rather large, moves its members to begin advocating strongly for suffrage as a way to ban alcohol or to ensure that alcohol will be banned. But of course, by 1912, the Congressional Union is organized, and it begins to advocate for a much more, you might say, violent or active status of pushing demonstrations, placards embarrassing the president, President Wilson at many different points. So the strategies include things like chaining themselves to the White House fences. When women are arrested and thrown into jail, they're thrown into jail with common criminals. And of course, once in jail, when they're badly treated, they go on hunger strikes, not as often, not as serious as the British hunger strikes, but they really begin to insist that this is no longer a matter for discussion, this is a matter for action.
And today, saying that women should have the right to vote seems obvious, it seems second nature. But at the time, they had to present arguments for why women should have the right to vote. What were some of these arguments?
Well, one of the ways to think about that question is to reverse it. What were the arguments against women having a right to vote? And of course, the big argument there was that it was going to disrupt the traditional family. That if the family was imagined as a unit and the male was imagined as the head of the unit, then the argument was that giving women the right to vote would divide that unit up, would divide men against women, husbands against wives, would challenge the patriarchal structure of the household itself. So to many people, it seemed as though giving women the right to vote was going to sort of challenge the very underpinnings of society. So reverse that, and you'll see that those who argued for the right to vote are saying, no, we will not undermine the home if we get the right to vote. We will strengthen the home. We will strengthen the home by bringing the voice of the home, the voice of morality into the public arena. so that women who are known to be more moral and more caring will bring those values into the polity. And that was the biggest argument for the vote. And despite the arguments, and there were of course other arguments for autonomy and so on, that was the argument that most people think had most purchase.
Is that what we call the expediency argument?
Expediency, yes, although expediency also involved giving up some things. So if you were going to argue that women would bring into the polity the values of womanhood, then you were going to have to say, well, which women do that? And so those who made that argument separate themselves from African American women, for instance, from immigrant women who are thought to be ignorant and uneducated, and by separating them, they thought to strengthen the idea of the home, or they make the argument that their job in the polity will be to educate women in the home so that when they get the vote, they will vote according to their moral conscience, not according to crass political beliefs or urges. So expediency has itself a kind of razor edge.
And of course, those kinds of divisions lead in a way to a cruel irony. For African American women, at the very moment women are gaining the right to vote, African American women, African Americans more generally across the South, are being disenfranchised by the rise of Jim Crow.
That's exactly right. And for African Americans, especially African Americans in the South, the rise of Jim Crow, which begins in the 1890s, late 1880s and 1890s, which is a specific effort to disenfranchise African Americans. Because it's African American males of whom most people are afraid, the effort to enfranchise women can both be seen as a way around the Jim Crow laws, but it also, of course, plays right into the Jim Crow laws, because African American women don't believe that they will actually be able to vote, even if they technically have the right to vote.